Welcome to the Storage Best Practices, Performance Tuning, and Troubleshooting breakout session. This is a lot more people than I expected. When I first was designing these slides, I sort of had anticipated maybe 50 people coming to it. So this is a big difference from what I was sort of imagining. My name is Dwayne Fafard. I'm a senior storage architect with IBM. Specifically, I'm on the XIV team at IBM. So just a few things I just want to level set with everybody here is that I'll be talking about two different types of storage technologies. One being traditional arrays where you have a clustered environment and you'll have like two controllers with centralized cache, centralized processor. And also be talking about storage arrays sort of like XIV where it's a grid architecture, more of a virtualized array. Another thing I just want to mention is that, like I said, I work for XIV, so all the screenshots that I have here are based on an XIV array. I also used Brocade switches, so I'll be referring to some Brocade commands. Cisco has some similar functionality, so they can be ported across the two. But that's what I had in our lab environment, so that's what I ended up using. So as the title reads, I'll be talking about best practices for storage, storage performance and tuning, and troubleshooting some SAN issues. So let's just jump right into best practice for storage. The way I wanted to sort of organize this was I wanted to just go from how I would set up a net new environment. I generally start at the SAN array, then I'll start at the SAN fabric, then I'll go down to the storage array, and after that I'll start looking at the host. So at the host level, we'll be talking about some queue depths, and then path policy as well. Then we'll look at the file systems that you put your data on. And I'll just talk a little bit about fan-out ratio at the end of the best practice section. So when it comes to your SAN fabric, I really wanted to start off with best practices for your physical environment, so the physical hardware. You always want to make sure you have no single point of failure. And to that end, one way you can do that is by always have multiple HBAs within your ESX host. So you want to have two physical HBAs. Some places where I've seen people put single HBA in with two ports on it, which I don't really recommend, is in a blade environment where there were some restrictions at one point where some of the blade systems only had a single PCI slot. So in that case there, you're limited to having a dual port, single card. And I've had a few calls from customers saying, hey, I lost an HBA and my entire SAN went down. What happened? This is supposed to be a fully redundant system. And that was a single point of failure right there. It was either the slot or the card went bad. So you always want to make sure you have dual connectivity into your SAN fabric. Another thing you want to make sure that you have is you want to make sure that from your host, you want to see multiple ports on your storage array. So for example, for XIV, what you'll want to see is you'll have two fabrics, and you'll want your fabric A and fabric B to see all ports on your storage array. So in this instance here, you have HBA A going into fabric A, the blue side, and HBA B going to fabric B, the orange side. So in this instance here, the XIV array has 6 controllers. I'll be using the terms I/O module and controllers interchangeably with XIV, just so you know that. So in this instance here, this would be best practice for an XIV array. For a traditional storage array where you have dual cluster, you'll want to have your controller A, you'll want to have your host seek a port on controller A and one on controller B, and your second HBA B seek a port on controller A and controller B as well. That way, when you have a traditional array, when you're setting up your LUNs, you always have to specify what an only controller is. So if you have an only controller on controller A for that LUN, and you lose a path on that controller, all it has to do is fail over to the other path on that controller itself. It doesn't need to fail over to the other controller. Well, you run into problems when it actually has to fail over to the other controller. You get LUN thrashing. You also get what's called as trespassing, or you get what could be called as proxy reads, meaning you're going through the wrong controller to do a read. So you actually have to go through the controller, the non-optimal controller, and then you on a backplane, you're talking to the original owning LUN controller, and that causes some performance degradation right there. If you want to do belt and suspenders for the XIV array, you can just double up on the amount of ports that you're adding, or if you need more performance, if you need more throughput, you may want to add more onto there. Same thing with a traditional array. Generally speaking, you have more than 2 ports on each controller, so you probably want to put more than just 2 ports going in. But best practice minimums would be to have multiple ports going to the storage array. So when we get into zoning, there's two different types of zoning. Actually, there's more than two different types, but what I want to talk about is port versus worldwide name. There's some instances where port zoning may be a necessity for you. There may be some companies may have some security requirements saying that we need port zoning, and that might be some sort of security policy that you have in place. My personal preference is to use worldwide name zoning. I worked in a lab environment for 4 years prior to coming to IBM, and we had multiple storage arrays, and we were constantly moving server from one rack to another, physical server. So when you do when you're doing changes like that, all you really need to do is unplug the cable from one switch and plug it into another switch in the same fabric, and it'll resume its zoning configuration. There's no need to worry about having to change the port, change your zoning. So there are some pros and cons to port and worldwide name zoning. Port is a lot more overhead, so you have to more management overhead on your side. The different types of zoning that you can actually that are best practices are single initiator, single target, or single initiator, multiple target. The commonality between the two is the single initiator. You always want to have single initiator in your zone set. What initiator is who's initiating that I/O request. So you have your host, which is an initiator, and the target is basically what it sounds like. A target's a target. A target's your storage array. So in some instances, some storage vendors will require you to have single initiator, single target. And there are some limitations with the reason why some vendors recommend that is because there are limitations with replication and so on that you require to have single. There is more overhead involved. If we go back to this picture here, if I was doing single initiator, single target for this environment here, I would have 6 zones. And for this one here, I would have 12 zones. If I did single initiator, multiple target, for this environment here, I would have 2 zones. And this environment here, I'd also have 2 zones. So much less overhead. Single initiator, single target does give you more isolation, though. If you have a flaky HBA in your environment and you have multiple entries within your zone set, or within your zone itself, that flaky HBA could be sending chatter across that entire zone. So if you have single, it's limited to those 2 entities within that zone. And that can really isolate the problem for you. So XIV recommends using single initiator, multiple target, and zone at least 1 port from every controller to the host. For a traditional system or other arrays, basically follow what the vendor recommends. If the vendor recommends you single initiator, single target, definitely use that. If you don't, then if you ever have a problem coming up, and you call the support line's going to say, well, you're not following our best practices. So make sure you follow what the best practices are. And make sure you're zoning at least 2 ports from your controller to your hosts, from each controller to your host. So now we talked about the SAN fabric. Let's get down to the storage array itself. So this is, if you guys can take away one thing from this seminar, this is what I want you to take away from this one here. Sizing the storage array. You always want to size it for performance. I purposely put this slide at the beginning so I could make sure I got your attention before people started to leave or people started to nod off. So I want to make sure this one was captured. Always size the LUNs for performance. And a way to do that is you need to understand what your I/O is doing from your application. So you have to understand how much I/O your application is doing or how much I/O your virtual machine is doing. And a way to do that is you need to capture the I/O profile. And what I mean by that, you need to gather data based on how much IOPS you're doing. Not only average IOPS, you want to be able to capture your peaks as well. In this example here, we have an average of about 2,500 IOPS, but then we also have a peak of about 7,000 IOPS. So if you're sizing your array, you want to size it for that 7,000 IOPS, because if you don't, then you will have performance problems when you get to that 7,000 IOPS during that time frame. There's a calculation here that you would use for a traditional storage array to figure out how many drives you need. Basically what you would do is you would take the total amount of IOPS, so in this case here, let's take that 7,000 number, and let's just pretend it was a 70-30, 70% read, 30% write, which is a very common profile. You multiply by the RAID penalty. What I mean by RAID penalty is every time you're doing a write, for example, with a RAID 10, you're writing to one disk, but then it has to be written to another. So that's a RAID penalty of 2. So in that case, you'd have a RAID penalty of 2. Rate penalty for RAID 6 and for RAID 5 and RAID 6 are 4 and 6. When I first originally saw these numbers here, I didn't really believe those numbers. In order for a RAID array to have a RAID 5 array to have a penalty of 4, it had to be a pretty dumb RAID array, because generally speaking, what happens is when you have a RAID 5, you're basically just updating one disk, and you're updating the parity on the other disk. You don't have to write to all of them. So let me just put it this way: if all the arrays of the world came together and made a village, this would be the village idiot of storage arrays. So you take that number, you multiply by the write percentage. So we take 7,000 times 2, let's just pretend we're using RAID 10, and then multiply that by 30% for the reads. Then you just add that to the amount, for the writes. Then you just add that to the amount of reads that you're doing. So 7,000 times the 70%. You divide that then by the raw performance of the disk. And the raw performance of the disk depends on the speed of the disk. So a 15K hard drive does about 150 IOs, a 10K hard drive does about 100 IOs, and a 7200 RPM drive does about 80 IOs. These numbers will probably differ depending on who you talk to. I've had good success using these numbers here, 150 for the 15K drive. So what you do is you just divide that number by 150, and it comes up with 60 drives. What you probably also notice is that this did not take into factor cache at all. So we're just really talking about disk speeds right here. So this is a very safe IOP number. So if you follow this graph here, or this calculation here, it's a very safe number to use when you're calculating how many disks you need for your storage performance. So in this situation, you need about 60 drives for a 7,000 IOP workload. If you wanted to, if budget constraints didn't allow you to get 60 drives, or if you wanted to scale back a little bit, what you could do is you could go to like the 95th percentile of that 7,000. So the 95th percentile would probably drop that down considerably. Probably drop that peak down to about 5,000, and that would drop your number of 60 down to a number quite a bit lower as well. But what you have to remember is, even though those are safe numbers, if you ever do hit that 7,000 IOP number, you have to be prepared that you may have performance problems if you didn't size it for the 7,000 IOPS. Other considerations: are these LUNs being replicated? If they're being replicated and are being replicated synchronously, the amount of disks at your primary site may not be a factor anymore. Your gating factor may be the distance between your primary site and your secondary site. You may have too large of a latency there. So it doesn't matter how many disks you have at your primary site. If that latency between the two sites is too large, that may be your problem right there, and that might cause some performance issues. So take that into consideration as well. There's also how many VMs you have per data store. How many people here have heard of the SCSI-3 reservations? Quite a few of you. So for those of you who don't, SCSI-3 reservations, what it is every time a machine is powered up or powered down, or you're taking a snapshot of that machine, a lock goes on the LUN. And that lock affects everything that's on that LUN there. So if you have multiple machines, multiple virtual machines on that LUN itself, all those LUNs get locked. All those machines get locked. It's a momentary point in time, but it gets locked. So you have lots of those going on at a time, and you could have performance problems. So that's why there's a sort of a limit of 15 for data stores. With ESX 4.1, they've actually resolved that problem. So VMware has done a really good job of what they've implemented is hardware assist locking. And what that does is, rather than locking the entire LUN, you're just locking small blocks. You're just blocking at the block level now. So you can have a lot more virtual machines in a 4.1 environment than you can with a pre-4.1 environment. XIV actually recommends using larger LUNs, so using 1 to 2 terabyte LUNs. So you don't need to use extents anymore, and simplifies data store management. Got a question?
So the hardware assist locking would typically, the magic number is 500K LUN. So could you see if you do 2 terabyte LUNs or something like that without any performance?
Well, no. What I mean by for this, sorry. Oh, sorry. The question was, if you have hardware assist locking, the limit before was using 500 gig LUNs. So with the hardware assist locking, can you go to larger than 500 gig LUNs? You still need to size your array for performance. So first and foremost, you want to size for the amount of I/O going to it. So yes, you can go to a larger LUN, but you still have to make sure you're sizing for performance. The reason why we recommend larger LUNs with XIV is because all the data is striped across all the disks within the array, and all the components within the array are used equally. So that's why we recommend using larger LUNs. And with the use of larger LUNs, you no longer need to use extents, and it actually simplifies your data store management. So you don't have multiples of those 500 gig LUNs. You can just have some larger 2 terabyte LUNs. For traditional arrays, size for performance. Yes? Sorry? Block size on the LUN? For VMFS, we don't really have any recommendations for that. Just follow what the default is for that. Does that make sense? Where was I? Okay, so we use larger LUNs. For traditional arrays, size for performance. If the capacity is more than what the I/O requirements are, then you just need to, that's a good thing. If you have more disk than what you actually require for capacity-wise, that's good. Every time you're adding a virtual machine into your environment, make sure you're going back to your calculations. Make sure you're revisiting this calculation here. You want to make sure that you aren't over using your RAID array. So if you have the problem that I usually see with my experience is that you have your storage team, then you have your VMware team, and sometimes they don't talk. So you have the VMware team who will actually go start creating some more VMs, the whole server sprawl problem, and they see all this storage there, and they just keep on adding more VMs into the environment, and that causes performance problems in the long run. So you have to make sure that every time you're adding a virtual machine into your RAID array, into your environment, you revisit the calculations here to figure out what's going on. All right, so now let's get down to the host. Adjusting the queue depth is one of the host settings that you can actually use. I can't take credit for this picture here. I got this from Virtual Geek's website, so I'm not sure if he did it or not, but I really like it. So what we're looking at here is basically it's the whole life cycle of an I/O. You start off at the top at the ESX server, then you go down through the switches into the storage array, and as you can see, there's multiple queues involved in the whole lifespan of an I/O. The ones that we're going to be talking about most here will be the VM kernel queue and the LUN device queue. So the LUN device queue, what that is, it's the amount of in-flight commands that are being sent from the host for an individual LUN to the storage array. And so for the default is 32 for QLogix and MLX. So that'll allow 32 IOPS being sent to the storage array at one time for each LUN. This is a LUN-based setting. The VM kernel queue, what that is if you have multiple virtual machines on a data store, what that number does is it will allow that number to be submitted to the LUN device queue. So it goes from the VM kernel queue down to the LUN device queue. If the VM kernel queue is actually higher than the LUN device queue, it sort of acts as an overflow for the LUN device queue, and it'll just store them in there. Generally, you want to keep those numbers the same. You always want to, as you increase one, you want to increase the other. Keep them at the same level. So I always get asked, when should I change it? What would cause me to want to change the queues? Basically, follow the vendor's recommendations. XIV recommends for VMFS to change it to, for VMware to change it to 64K. So in that instance, you'd want to change it. So follow what your vendor recommends. Also, if your application administrator is sort of telling you, hey, my application, the IOs I'm sending from my application are starting to queue up on the application side. What can you do to help me out? Basically, what you can do is you can increase the queue on the HBA, allow more IOs to go out. Also, while you're doing that, you want to make sure you're looking at the performance of the array itself, too. You want to make sure that you're not oversaturating, you're not causing any problems on the storage array. So as you're increasing the queue depth, you want to look at your storage array and make sure that it's not suffering any latencies either. Make sure that you're walking a fine line when you're making these changes. You change the number too high, it will cause latencies on the storage array. If it's too low, you could be having latencies on the host side. So you have to make sure you're following. Yes? Sorry, 64. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, limitations of HBAs themselves are in the 4,000 to 5,000 range for their queues. So sorry, I meant 64. So yeah, that actually brings us to this last point here. Well, one other thing. When you are making these changes, make sure you're making the changes to everything in the cluster, because this is a per host setting. So you want to make sure if you have multiple hosts in your cluster, you're changing it for all of them, because if you migrate it from one to another, it may not get the setting as you're moving them from one to the other. So calculating the queue depth, you just want to make sure that you're not hitting the maximum limit of the HBA itself. And that would be number 4 here, the HBA queue. HBAs have a physical limitation of how many IOPS they can actually push through through the card. So you want to make sure you're not maxing that out either. Easy calculation for that is take your device queue setting number, multiply by the number of LUNs, making sure you're not hitting that number. To view what those numbers are, you can just use this cat command and just the location of the actual card itself. So from the console, you just type in that cat command. It'll actually pipe out the information that you need for the queue depths. And one thing to remember, those numbers are in hex. So if you see a queue depth of 20, that's actually 32. So it's in hex, so you have to make the calculation. But when you're making the changes with these commands here, you're actually just putting them in decimal. So when you're making the changes here, they're in decimal. When you're viewing them, they're in hex. To make the changes, it's just an ESX-CFG-module command. For ESXi, I put them in brackets. It's a VI-CFG-module command. VMware is on its way to going to ESXi. So whether you like it or not, we're going to have to start getting used to using the VMA and the ESXi commands. To change the VM kernel, basically you go into the advanced settings of the configuration tab, and you're just changing the disk schedule num request outstanding. And like I said, make sure those numbers are the same between the device LUN queue and the kernel queue. So now we talked about the device queue, so the queues. Let's go down to path policies. So with path policies, what ESX has done in 4.x is that it's now ALUA compliant. This is a really, really good thing that they've added into the environment. What ALUA does for you is it allows the hypervisor to actually interrogate the controllers to find out whether or not that LUN is on its owning controller. Remember how I mentioned to you how when you're setting up your LUNs, you have an owning controller? ALUA will be able to detect whether that LUN is on an owning controller. So it's a very nice feature that they've added into it. There are 4 different policies. My favorite is round robin. It's ALUA compliant. So what it does is it basically just takes one and it'll pick the next one, just what like round robin sounds to you. The next is most recently used. It's also ALUA compliant. This is the default for active passive arrays. So this is what will automatically show up when you have an active passive array attached to your environment. And what that does is it selects the first path that it sees upon boot. So you have to be careful with MRU and fixed as well. So I'm sure a lot of you had the experience of fixed and having to balance these out manually. With fixed, it's not ALUA compliant. So what they did in 4.1 is they came up with fixed AP. And fixed AP is ALUA compliant. So that allows you the fixed functionality for an active passive array. Prior to 4.0, when round robin was just experimental, I couldn't really recommend to my customers to use round robin because it was experimental. So what we ended up doing is having to go to use fixed for our active arrays. And then you had to go through each one of them and manually balance them. It was really painstaking. I'm sure a lot of us see some nodding heads out there saying they've been through that before. So that's where I really like round robin. Round robin really helps you out there. Some of the options with round robin is you can tweak it a little bit. So you can tweak it by bytes or by IOPS. The default for bytes is 10 megabytes, and the default for IOPS is 1,000 IOPS. Some vendors recommend changing that down to 1. I would follow your vendor's recommendations. Changing it down to 1 will guarantee that after every I/O, it'll pick a new path. So you're guaranteed that it'll be balanced across all of them. But I found setting it at the default for an XIV array hasn't had any negative impact at all. So changing There's some commands that you can do to change these devices, and it's basically just a ESX CLI command. So what you do is just do ESX CLI, NMP round robin, and then you do set config. Then you do like a -D, and you put the device in after that, where I have device written in there. The device being, if you look at just below that, it says EUI 001738, and there's a bunch of numbers after that. That designates an XIV array. So if I was to change it for XIV array, I'd put a -D, then that EUI number, and -T. -T is for type. So do you want to change it based on IOPS or by bytes? And so you'd either choose -T, then IOPS or bytes. Make sure you put the double quotes around IOPS or bytes. And then -I or -B, and you put a number in. -I for IOPS, so you put -I for IOPS, and then the number of IOPS you wanted to change after. If you want to change them all at one time, you can use this for loop. This for loop basically is just grepping out the information of your devices, and it's just inputting it into that same command that we had above there. One thing I'd really recommend is just changing the SATP to begin with. SATP is a storage array type plugin, and basically what that does is it tells the array, or sorry, it tells ESX what type of path policy to use for that type of array. So the default for ALUA, XIV is an ALUA compliant storage array, so it would pick ALUA. The default for ALUA is MRU. So in our instance, we'd want to change that from MRU to round robin, and this command does that for you. So every path from every LUN that you add from that point forward will now get round robin. So the best policy to use really depends on what type of storage array you have. So follow your vendor's recommendations. XIV recommends round robin, and use the default settings. All right, let's get into the different file systems. VMFS is an RDM. ESX or VMware has really done a good job with their file system. It's a very low overhead. So if you are looking to make a decision whether to use VMFS or RDM based on performance, don't make this a deciding factor for whether you want to use VMFS or RDM. In the 3.5 days, VMware actually published a paper, and what that paper showed is that for small random IOPS, an RDM had marginally better performance, but it was just marginal. So there wasn't a compelling reason to go to an RDM if you wanted to use VMFS. The reasons why you'd want to use an RDM is if you need to do any low-level type of SCSI communication from the virtual machine to the storage array. If you wanted that virtual machine to issue SCSI commands over that LUN to your storage array, for example, if you wanted to fracture a LUN or if you wanted to sync a LUN, that's where you have to use a physical RDM. Other times you'd want to use it if you want to use array-based snapshots. Array-based snapshots will require an RDM because if it's within a VMFS, you can't take a snapshot of just what's on that VM. So another thing that I like to use RDMs for, that I've used in my past, is sort of a level of QoS. And what I mean by that is when you set up an RDM, that RDM is dedicated to a single virtual machine. You can't share that RDM with another one. So in that sense, you are setting it to a level of QoS. You are dedicating that amount of I/O that you set up on your storage array to that virtual machine itself. With a VMFS can be shared amongst multiple virtual machines, and it will give someone the ability to share that. One thing you just have to make sure on the back end is that you aren't spreading that RAID set that you took that RDM from to other things within your environment. So that will sort of defeat the whole purpose of using it for an RDM or using it as a level of QoS. Lastly, I just want to touch on is fan-out ratios. Being on the storage side, fan-out ratio to me is I'm the storage array, I'm fanning out how many hosts can I see. So in that sense, fan-out ratio to me is how many hosts to one port on my storage array. And the reason why it's important to know this information, or to really understand what's going on here, is because you don't want to oversaturate or to oversubscribe your host ports. So you want to make sure you have a good balance of host ports on your host side as well as on your storage array side. So remember when we, during the sizing exercise of the array, we were gathering the IOP information. At the same time, you'll want to gather the amount of megabytes per second that's happening on the array as well. And what you want to do is basically just figure out how many megabytes per second that you're doing and compare that to how many megabytes per second you have available on your host ports. So in that sense, you just want to make sure that you're not oversubscribing the amount of bandwidth that you have on your host ports. All right, let's get into some performance tuning things we can talk about. So what I want to go over is Performance 101, balancing paths, storage I/O control, which is new in 4.1, setting the LUN offset, and tuning the storage array. So I always ask my customers, how is performance measured? And the common answer is by the amount of IOPS an array can do. How many people agree with that statement? I don't really. It's more so by the amount of IOP, or the amount of time it takes an IOP to respond to a request. You measure performance by latency and not by the amount of IOPS. Marketing people, no matter what company you go to, marketing people like to throw out these huge numbers saying, our storage array can do 5 million IOPS, but what they don't tell you is that it's going to take 500 milliseconds to do those 5 million IOPS. And at 500 milliseconds, you can't really do a whole lot. So the reason why latency is so important is because applications require a certain amount of latency, require the request being returned in a certain amount of latency. For example, databases, Oracle databases, SQL databases, they generally want to see about a 10 millisecond response time. 5 milliseconds write and up to 15 milliseconds read for an average of about 10. So once you start exceeding that 10 milliseconds, you'll start to see some performance issues. You'll start getting calls from your help desk, and they're going to come at you, poking you in the face, saying, what's going on with the storage array? We're seeing some performance problems. And Microsoft Exchange, they say 20 milliseconds. So it really depends on the application, but it's measured in milliseconds. So how do you want to get started? You want to do some baselines of your environment. So you want to gather some statistics during a normal time frame. What I mean by normal is there's no anomalies going on in the environment. You don't have anything weird happening. And you want to capture some statistics. So you want to grab your IOPS, your throughput, your latency, what your read-write percentages, and one real interesting one is capacity. So both the total and the use. One trend that I've actually seen is as the used capacity goes up, so does the latency. So they actually trend pretty evenly with some arrays. And the reason why that is because most arrays will start to write on the outside of the platter or the disk. As you start getting closer to the center of the disk, your seek times increase, which increase the latency. So it's just an interesting stat that I've actually seen in the past. When we're talking about balancing paths, we want to make sure you're balancing from both sides. So in ESX, we talked about this already. You want to make sure that everything's balanced evenly. So with fixed, if you're using fixed, you want to make sure that your paths are balanced across all paths available. And with 4.0, we're using round robin. I really recommend round robin. I've said it a few times already, so I feel it's really important. If you have the ability to use round robin with your storage array, I definitely would. So make sure you're balancing the ports on your ESX side. You also want to balance them on the storage side too. On the storage side, this is an XIV. This is actually the performance tool within XIV. And what you can see is, you can't really see it too well, but what it's showing is that you have 6 controllers, 4, 5, and 6, and then 7, 8, 9 at the bottom. And each one of those lines is doing about 3,000 IOPS for a total of, as you can see at the bottom there in the middle, about 19,000 IOPS. So you can see that everything's balanced evenly across that. For a traditional array, when you have owning controllers, what you'll want to do is you want to balance the LUNs across both controllers. So you want to take, if you have 10 LUNs, you want to take half the LUNs, put them on controller A, the other half on controller B. And not necessarily take all the odds going on to A, all the evens going on to B. That may not balance it out appropriately. You want to look at how many IOPS are actually doing. You want to say, okay, you may have 7 on controller A and 3 on controller B. If those 3 on controller B are your heavy hitters, then you'll want to make sure that those ones are based on IOPS and not necessarily just the number of LUNs you have going through your controllers. So let's talk about SIOC now. This is something new in 4.1. How many people here have heard of SIOC? A few people? Good. It's actually, what SIOC allows you to do is it gives you the same functionality that you have with with sharing CPU and memory. It extends that to the data store now. So you would enable it at the data store level, and then you would set up your shares at the virtual machine level. And the way that it actually is engaged is you have to reach the certain amount of threshold for a sustained period of time across all the hosts that are attached to that data store. That threshold by default is set at 30 milliseconds, and that's a tunable setting. So when you go to enable SIOC, there's an advanced button there, and that will allow you to change that number up and down or to whatever you want it to be. So some requirements, SIOC enabled data stores have to be managed by the same vCenter server. It only supports iSCSI and Fiber Channel, no NFS or RDMs. And you can have data store extents, so it won't work with data store extents. If you're using an array that has an auto-tiering feature in it, make sure it's on the hardware compatibility list. It's very important because there are some incompatibilities between their auto-tiering and how SIOC works. So make sure it's on that list and it's been approved. Here's just a quick view of what's happening with and without SIOC. So on the left, you see that the data mining and the print server have sort of the lion's share of the throughput. You don't necessarily want that to happen. So with SIOC enabled, with the shares in place, the shares actually give priority to your online store in Microsoft Exchange. And that's basically what you want. And what it's doing, here's a more granular look at it. So in this example here, you have two ESX servers. And you see the ESX servers each have 50% of the queue. And even though VM-A has 1,500 shares and the other two each have 500, VMC with only 500 shares is still getting 50% of the storage. With SIOC enabled, it balances it all out. It actually puts those shares into place, and it allows, so VMA now has the ability to have more access to the storage array. So when you want to set it, you would set your disk shares, and there's also limit IOPS, and you'd set it either to low, normal, or high, and there's also the custom setting that you could actually specify how many shares you want. When you're looking at the actual limit IOPS, low, normal, or high, it's the default as everything else, but those numbers there aren't actual numbers of IOPS going through. It's just the number of shares and not a number of IOPS. So when you're changing that threshold of 30 milliseconds, you have to take into consideration what you want to actually achieve. If you want to achieve more granular isolation, you'd want to lower that number down from 30 milliseconds down to like 20 milliseconds or 15 milliseconds. As you're lowering it down, you get better isolation, meaning that your throttling will kick in a lot quicker. So if you have your online store that you want to have most access to, put that number a bit lower. But what it does at that same time is it will limit the amount of throughput that you can get through to the array as well. So you could be harming yourself by putting that number too low by limiting the amount of megabytes going through. As you're putting that number up higher, you're weakening the isolation. So if you set it to like 50 milliseconds, it would weaken the isolation, and it would allow the opportunity for your print server to have more access to the storage array than your Microsoft Exchange. So you want to make sure that you play with these numbers, or you test it out a little bit before actually putting it in your production. If you do plan on using SIOC, there's excellent reference material on VMware's website. Very important. It's a must-read if you want to implement this. So VMFS is a file system, just like any other file system, and it's suspect to the same hardware constraints. So you have to make sure that you're following best practices around setting the LUN offset. VMware and the storage arrays have actually both come a long ways with this. If you are setting up your VMFS through vCenter, it actually sets the LUN offset for you. And because if you don't set the LUN offset properly, you could get what's called boundary crossings or stripe crossings. Different vendors call it different things. So you can be crossing boundaries, and that could impact your performance considerably. You could have a 20% gain of performance just by setting up your offset to the proper setting that it should be at. So you can still do it manually, but it's recommended just do it through vCenter. On the storage array side, what you want to do is when you're setting up your host definition on the storage array, you want to make sure that host definition, you set it up with a proper guest OS. Most times you have an option for VMware nowadays to set up with your host definition on the storage side. So make sure you're setting up for VMware on your array side, and that will do some things. The storage array will do some things as well on their side when you're setting up the host definitions. So tuning the storage array, this is one slide I probably could have spent the whole hour on, but what I ended up doing is I ended up just narrowing it down to the main topics that I've seen in my experience, so the main problems. First off is just lack of IOPS. So your applications are suffering, not getting the performance you want. Basically what that is you don't have enough disks on the back end. You are losing out on performance on your back end. So a way to get around that is to either move some stuff off that onto a new RAID set or increase the amount of disks within that RAID set. So there's a couple ways you can handle that. Performance degrades during a backup window. Generally that means is you have some sort of cache contention going on. Storage arrays love sequential I/O, and what they'll do is a storage array will grab it'll prefetch as much data as it possibly can and throw it into cache. So what's happening there is you're saturating your read cache, not allowing other applications access into that cache, and that will dramatically cause performance problems on your storage array. So a way around that is if you have the ability to partition the cache with your storage array, partition some cache for your backup LUN or whatever type of sequential operation that you're doing, and dedicate some cache to your production LUNs. Another thing you can do is you can try adding more cache, but more likely than not, you'll just be giving more cache to the backup operation to hog as well. Lastly, turn off read-ahead cache for that backup LUN or that LUN that's doing that sequential operation. Your backup window will be extended, but it will stop the performance problem from happening on that whatever else you have running at the same time. Another issue, bandwidth-intensive applications performing poorly. So what happens here is you most likely have a fan-out ratio problem, like you don't have the ports balanced evenly. So in that instance, you probably want to increase the amount of host ports you have on your storage array, or just try to balance them out more evenly. You can also, if you have to figure out where your bottleneck is it at the storage side or is it at the host side? If it's at the host side, add some more HBAs at your host level. If it's at the storage side, add more ports, or make sure that you have your ports balanced out evenly, that you have the same amount of megabytes per second going across each path themselves. And lastly, hardware failures. It's hard to get around these. Everybody experiences hardware failures. If you have a hard drive fail and you have a hardware failure, you can just move that one, storage vMotion from one RAID set to another RAID set. If you have a controller failure, you either have to move it from one array to another complete array, or if you can't do that, you'll just have to just wait out until the actual controller gets replaced. So let's go quickly into troubleshooting the storage array itself. So the three different areas you want to look at: SAN fabric, ESX host, and the actual storage array. I always like to look at the SAN fabric first. The SAN fabric is the glue that holds it all together. You have your storage array at one side, you have your host at the other, and then in the middle you have your fabric. That's the glue that's holding it all together. It's a good place to start to look because it shows you both sides whether or not what's going on. You can see performance problems, you can see hardware problems. In this picture here, I just ran the command port error show. And what it's showing you is it's showing all the errors that are happening on the SAN switch itself. I'm Java challenged, so I don't really like using the GUI, so I just end up using Telnet, and it works a lot quicker. So what you're looking at here is you want to take the TX and RX, so the transmit and receive numbers, and add those up. If the amount of ENC out errors, which is the first sort of in the middle there, the one with all the numbers, take the ENC encoding out error numbers. If that number is greater than 1% of the total transmit receive, then you probably have a fiber cable problem. So that would point to a fiber cable problem. If you're throwing some CRC errors into it, so the fourth line over is CRC errors, If you throw some CRC errors onto that same port, it's most likely an SFP problem on your Brocade switch. All the numbers to the right are your disconnects, your link fail, loss of sync, and so on. Those numbers there will usually point to something outside of the switch at the other end. So if you see lots of numbers going up on the other end there, then you'll know it's probably whatever's on the other end, whether it's the host or whether it's the storage array itself. And then you want to go look at those numbers there. Other things you can look at is you can look at performance within the switch itself. These commands you can either run it through Telnet or you can look at the GUI. So the command is port perf show, and what this does, it shows you how many megabytes per second are going through the switch itself. So this is a scrolling number. It keeps on scrolling through. It'll keep on updating itself. The tough part is you need to know what ports you want to look at. So once you find it, you want to look at it and make sure you're not hitting any maximums. A 4 gig switch runs at about 400 megabytes per second, 2 gig, 200 megabytes per second, and 8 gig, 800 megabytes per second. So once you start reaching near those numbers, so if you had a 4 gig switch and you're running at about 350, 380 megabytes per second, that's getting very high. You're getting very good throughput on that port there. You'll want to start looking, making sure you're not oversaturating that one port and spread things out. So it's a quick look at, looking at the SAN fabric is a very quick way to figure out what's going on in your total environment. At the ESX host side, you'll always want to check your logs, make sure there's no hardware failures. But then you want to look at, I like using ESX top. So there's 3 different ways you can look at your storage devices, at your storage array. You can look at it at the adapter level, device level, and at the VM level. So what we want to look at is we want to look at latencies. And the 3 that are most important are the D average, the K average, and the G average. The G average is the guess latency. The guess latency is the sum of the device and the kernel average. So device D average and K kernel average. The kernel average should most always be at 0 or very near 0. So in this instance here, we see we've got a little bit of a problem. We have a kernel average of 1.22. Not that we're having major problems. We're only at about 3 milliseconds latency, but still, the kernel average is at 1.22. So we want to take a look at what's going on there. So when we look at the queues themselves, we have the 2 queues in question are the disk queue length and the world queue length. The device queue length is the one that we set on the HPA, and then the world queue length is the VM kernel queue. So as we can see here, the world queue length is at 64 and the device is at 32. We have an active of 32, meaning that we're saturating the amount of devices going into the array, and we have a queued of 21. So the VM kernel queue is acting as an overload, as a overflow for the other array, for the other queue. If we change that to 64, the device long queue, we'll most likely see the queued number just disappear, and the active number will now become 53 in this example here. We'll also see the latency for the kernel average go down to 0. The device latency, that should almost always equal what you're seeing on your storage array. So when we get into the storage array, first thing I want to look at is make sure everything is connected to the array. Make sure host connectivity is in place. So to that end, you'll want to look at this one. In this example here, we have XIV 31 vSphere. We see 3 ports connected. If we scroll that bar over, we'd see another 3 ports for a total of 6 ports connecting to the array. So we know we've got connectivity. We have good connectivity there. Then we'll want to make sure that everything's balanced. So this is the same screenshot we saw before. We have 3,000 IOPS per path for a total of about just over 19,000. And you want to make sure that everything's balanced across the ports as well. Lastly, we want to look at latencies. So this is XIV's top utility. And basically what we're looking at here is we see that the LUN is doing 1 millisecond latency. This screenshot was taken moments after the other one, so there's a bit of discrepancy in the numbers. But we're seeing 1 millisecond latency, as back here we're seeing 1.78. So those numbers are very close. You want to make sure that those numbers are in sync pretty much all the time. So just to summarize, for storage best practices, you basically want to make sure that you have no single point of failure. So multiple HBAs talking to multiple ports on your storage array, whether it's XIV or traditional, you want to see multiple ports. Always size for performance. So when you're sizing your array, size for performance first and foremost. For queue depths, you want to make sure that you follow the vendor's recommendations. And only change the queue depths if you're actually experiencing problems. So after you've changed it, don't just go in willy-nilly and start playing with this queue depths, because you could cause some problems on the back end on the storage array. For path policies, follow what the vendor recommends. So XIV recommends round robin, but definitely follow what your vendor recommends. For file systems, use RDMs only if you need direct SCSI communications to the storage array, or if you want to do array-based snapshots or array-based replication. VMFS actually does a really good job. They have a lot of functionality built in. So using VMFS or using VMware snapshots or using VMware's VCB, you can't incorporate that into a physical RDM. So you need to take that in consideration too. What type of functionality you want to have with your file system? And just with fan-out ratios, just make sure you're not oversaturating your ports. It's pretty hard to saturate ports nowadays just because the ports are starting to get 8 gig, 16. Yep. Well, so the question was, how do you set up your fan-out? What's a good number for fan-out ratio? Basically, Windows systems can easily handle, well, an array can easily handle like 15 to 1 for a Windows system. So that's just a general number. It really depends on how much I/O you're pushing. So it's hard to say, it's hard to give a number saying an AIX server can do this much. And as far as NPIV goes, NPIV doesn't matter, because NPIV, as long as you're still talking about a host talking to a port, so whether it's NPIV or not doesn't matter at all. So it really depends on the amount of I/O that your applications are actually pushing. Yeah, you just have to make sure, like using NPIV or just using non-NPIV, you still have that host. It's still a host, so it doesn't really matter on that side. LUN offset, just make sure you're setting up your LUN offsets through vCenter. Tuning the storage array, just tune your storage array as needed. You need to add more disk, go ahead and add more disk, and so on. For troubleshooting, the biggest thing is to make sure you're looking at your environment as a whole. Make sure you're looking at everything together. Because if you just focus in on one spot, if you looked at it as a whole, you may discover something that you may have totally ignored just by looking at one spot. So look at everything together, and that will give you a broad picture of what's actually going on. Well, that's all. If there's any questions, we can take them now. Okay. All right, thank you.